Greetings. Welcome back to Living One. My name's Liz Burton-Crow. I'm the Director of Education for the Carrillo Center for Nonviolence. Living One is our free monthly webinar series where presenters from around the world share their vision about psychology, life, and culture in the absence of animal exploitation. Through Living One, we attempt to answer the question, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? This month, we welcome animal rights activist Krista Hiddema. She holds a master's degree in work, organization, and leadership, where her thesis focused on the human costs of the North American pork industry. Currently, Krista is pursuing a doctorate on the need to utilize ecofeminist principles in matters of board governance within the animal rights movement, with an emphasis on economic health, ecological health, and social health. Throughout her career, Krista led more than a dozen undercover investigations into factory farms and slaughterhouses across Canada, helped produce 4 investigatory news shows with W5, and has presented to the federal government on animal transportation. She is the president of Happily Ever Esther Farm Sanctuary, home of Esther the Wonder Pig, and serves as a strategic advisor to Egg Truth, One Protest, and the Rancher Advocacy Program, and as a reviewer for the Journal of Critical Animal Studies. Krista is also the executive director For the Greater Good, where she consults with animal rights organizations across the world on matters of governance and organizational development and intersectional justice. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Liz, and Gay, an absolute honor to be interviewed by you, my friend.
Okay, well, we're more excited than you are. It's hard to know where to start, but you know, Krista, even though we heard your brief bio, can you maybe help situate us and listeners to your arc and development or evolution that brought you to your work today?
Yes, it has been a long journey, Gay, unquestionably. I first learned about the plight of particularly factory farmed animals back in the 80s. So I'm an old vegan. I happened upon a book back in the day where there was no such thing as Facebook and we didn't have the internet the way that we have it today. But I happened upon a book that was entitled Diet for a New America. And that book was written by John Robbins. And for the viewers who might not know what that name might not quite ring a bell, John Robbins was the heir to the Baskin and Robbins fortune, so the ice cream company. And he wrote a book on factory farming. I read that book by pure happenstance. And after reading it, it changed my life, particularly after having come from a very large family of dairy farmers. My heritage is Dutch, and most people I know and most people I'm related to are dairy farmers. And despite that upbringing, I did not really realize what was happening, particularly to farmed animals. As soon as I did, I immediately left those animals off my plate. But what that really began for me was a 30+ year journey to becoming a full-time animal rights activist and to really evolving my own views about how animals should be treated in society and really what the most effective methods of doing so are.
So, you know, you said that it was a long journey, and I know in some part that you're referring to the, 30+ years that you just described. But what about the psychological, social changes that you experienced during that arc?
I think that if I look at my value system and the philosophies that I held even 20 years ago, they're very different than what they are today. And I think one of the things that when something like justice takes a hold of who we are, it's incumbent on us to continue to grow and to develop those belief systems. And we do them in all sorts of different ways. And for me, I'm a really avid reader. I read constantly. I read during the day, I read before I go to bed at night. And one of the things that I started doing early days and continue to do today is to educate myself on different ways that we view animals. And it's really been through that process that my own belief system about animals has evolved. So if I use sort of a really simple example, I would say that in my earliest days, I was more interested in animal welfare, that I didn't quite understand the concept of rights for animals in the way that I do today. So that's one example of my own philosophy having changed over the years and really moved to one of not only rights for animals, but the genuine and deep understanding of how the intersection of rights for all marginalized peoples are connected. If I were to answer your question from the social perspective, socially, there's no question that my life has changed dramatically. If I look at where I spend most of my time today, quite frankly, I spend most of my time with other activists. I spend far less time with individuals who are not also deeply involved in our movement. Now, it's not to say that we should all be doing that, because we have to communicate and be in a very non-vegan world, but where I choose to spend the majority of my social time really is with other people who are like-minded, because for me, it gives me a greater sense of peace and relaxation when I'm with them. And I think that socially we look for that sense of rejuvenation, where I find it easier to be rejuvenated through people who have a like value system. So again, it's that change of how we believe what we believe and where we're deciding to spend, our very precious time.
Well, I was going to thank you for bringing that in, because I was going to be saying or asking you asking you to comment. You are very active in terms of travel, for better or for worse.
I am.
So
I am.
One of the, I would say one of the hallmarks, one of the earmarks of working in animal rights and even in environmental activism, particularly animal rights, is a lot of people, a lot of humans feel very isolated. And that sense of isolation then is contrasted with this reaching out for animals, connecting, and then being with other humans who are not necessarily in the same ethical or political or spiritual vein and track that one is. So I guess I would just say, can you maybe expand on that a little bit, that obviously your travel is related to your work, and also professional and personal become sort of intertwined and almost one.
Yeah.
But do you feel like that's a very, that for you as an individual, as a psychological, social individual, do you feel that even though your travel and connecting and networking with individuals is work related, giving talks, consultation, that in itself is a very powerful wellspring for you personally?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely, Gay. And what's interesting is that back in the the late 80s, when I really started, let's call it, representing myself as a vegan person, I didn't know any vegans. I probably didn't meet another vegan until well in sort of past a decade of veganism. I didn't even know what veganism really was. And I certainly didn't know anybody else that was vegan. And I remember actually, I lived, at the time I was living in Toronto, in the city of Toronto. And they just so happened that it was the International Vegan Conference. It was a pure fluke, because apparently that conference, I think, is in a major city every couple of years. I don't remember exactly how many. But I walked into this conference, and it was the first time I had ever met another human being or spoken to another human being that was vegan. So for the first very long time, it was very isolating. And I think one of the beauties about social media, and I think we all have stories about where social media has been challenging for us, but one of the beauties of social media is providing that sense of community that very often is lacking for vegans. Liz, Dr. Burton Crow, her and I were talking about living in the country. She and I both live in the country. So often we don't know, perhaps our next door neighbor is likely not vegan, especially as a country dweller. But we get that through social media in a way that we never used to have that opportunity. And one of the things we know through a multitude of studies is one of the main reasons for recidivism, is for individuals who revert to consuming meat, dairy, or eggs, is a lack of community. So having community as a person who's interested in the rights of animals is something that we must seek out for our own well-being and our own mental health. And for me personally, Gay, when I do work and when I do the speaking circuit and I am consulting with sanctuaries, it is extraordinarily uplifting to be amongst people who share the same value system and who together we are fighting and we are on the side of right. And I think that for any one of the viewers, the listeners today, if you don't have a strong social network, please seek it out, because it is available to every one of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I think going back to some comments you made earlier, was this notion of it being this connection, sort of being embedded in a community which is not necessarily aligned with you, or with your own personal or your family values and ethics, but having both essentially keeps the mind, the psyche, and the movement, as being part of the movement, non-exclusive. In other words, always keeping the door open for a sense of porosity.
Right.
And having those balances. And I think you put that very beautifully, where the notion is that that really people who are like you, who are in the animal rights movement, who are being very intentional about drawing support, connection at a very fundamental level from quote unquote like-minded people, and at the same time interacting and being embedded in a community that may not. And I think that gives a lot of fluidity and dynamic to the movement as well.
It does. And I think the other thing that automatically flows from that is the ability to learn from one another. Mm-hmm. And, Gay, I can tell you from you, many of the conversations we've had, I've learned so much from you. And I think one of the beauties when we do connect with people is we have that opportunity to listen and learn. And that is only something that we get through community. And again, it doesn't have to be in person. For everybody out there who feels isolated physically, look at this lovely webinar, look at the community you're building at the Kirlos Center. There are so many ways to ensure that our own development as activists, whatever way that we're an activist by joining this webinar. So whichever way that we are going to move towards supporting the plight of animals, we must ensure that we're supporting and nurturing ourselves through that process too, to ensure the long-term work that we're all doing for animals, because it can be super darn depressing. There's no question about that. I often get asked by people, oh, don't you get depressed? Yes, I do. I can tell you recently, just on social media alone, I can barely look at these photos in Australia right now. I am heartsick, absolutely heartsick. It is depressing, but we also have to ensure that we're nurturing ourselves so that we can continue to be activists. For me, I hope to have another 30 years left, at least. I'm hoping. I think I can hit my early 80s and still be doing this. At least that's the game plan anyways. But I know that to do that means that I have to contemplate all aspects of our health, and the emotional and psychological is, of course, a critical component of that.
And another thing too, looking at a different scale, because we were kind of zoomed out, then we went zoom in at the medium scale, is within the quote unquote, and I'm using that quote unquote, I use it a lot, but on purpose, the animal rights movement, which is not homogeneous in whatsoever in terms of values and ethics and lifestyles and things like that. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that in terms of your development and your understanding and perspective of that heterogeneity within the movement as such.
Yes, that is a really good question and a really big question. So people who perhaps are not involved in the animal rights movement as a sort of profession like I am, sometimes look at the movement and think that everybody within it has the same way of thinking, and that is by far and away not even close. Within the movement itself, there are multiple schools of thought in terms of how activism should take place, and in terms of even what we're fighting for. There is also, unfortunately, a lot of fracture in the movement. There are certain aspects of it that are extraordinarily uncomfortable. There are, people are still people no matter what work they do. And although one might think that in the animal rights movement, everybody should be, rainbows and butterflies, it is unfortunately not the case. There are different schools of thought, particularly around at the highest level, going back to your analogy, Gay, of going out and going back in, at the highest level, or sort of the 30,000 foot level, there are very different schools of thought about the overall philosophy of rights. Should we be making decisions based on utilitarian principles? So those are principles that would have been initially promulgated by somebody like Peter Singer in his seminal book, Animal Liberation, in 1975. There's a very different school of thought that was promulgated through Tom Reagan in particular around what we talk about the right to life, that every individual animal is as critical as every other animal. Personally, my bias on the table is I'm more on that camp. I am not a utilitarian. But those two schools of thought have caused a lot of concern in our movement around where the finite energy and the finite sums of money should be spent. There's also been a lot of challenges in the movement around which animals we should focus on. Should we be only working for farmed animals because there are more of them in totality that are suffering, or should we be working for other aspects of the movement like entertainment animals? While there are far fewer of them, they too are suffering. And then there's other challenges in the movement where there are different forms of activism. Some are, unfortunately, some fall into certain violent categories. I don't personally subscribe to any form of violent activism. I'm a very strong proponent of activism that is nonviolent, but there are certain schools of thought around that in the movement. And there's been a lot of separation in the movement where certain groups have been starting their own conferences. And, I think fundamentally all forms of non-violent activism are critical. And one of the things that I personally would like to see everybody in the movement committing at least some time to is studying and understanding the evolution of social justice. I think we can truly learn so much from other justice movements. And as activists, I do believe that it is incumbent on us to make a commitment to understanding how social justice occurs and being able to use the learnings from previous movements in our own work. So I think if there's one takeaway for anyone who's listening who calls themselves an activist or would like to become an activist, it's really try to understand the lessons we've learned from other forms of activism, and really thinking about how those can be best applied to the plight of animals.
Well, in some ways, we're all activists, right?
Yes, we are.
You're not doing anything. I mean, there's a whole area, largely within the human sector. Of course, I'm not up to speed with all the literature that you are, where the notion of the bystander,
Yep.
the collaborator, there's different terms and of that. So in a sense, the term activist, I understand how you're using it, but in a sense, we're all activists. It's just, how we are relating to each other in the world.
You are right, Gay. You're absolutely right.
Well, no, I understand your notion of activist, and I think it's important because that term really carries a lot with it. It carries a lot of charge. So it's really important to think about it, but also in the fact, I think what you're bringing up is, even if you sit around and don't do anything or complain, you're still an activist.
You are. I mean, we do things by actively pursuing them or failing to pursue. Mm-hmm. And when we fail to pursue or we fail to speak up, we are being clear about what our value system is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but going back to that word sort of activism for a minute, you're absolutely right. But what I also believe about activism is that whether we are bringing vegan cupcakes to, you know, the staff room, or we're bringing, you know, great snacks that we're giving out that are cruelty free at Halloween for the children. I mean, those are all ways that every single one of us, no matter where we are in life, can really speak up for animals. And it's those forms of activism that are as important as every other form.
Mm-hmm. So what you're really underscoring is the essentiality, I think, of understanding animal rights subsumes human rights.
There's no question. Gay, and you know, the word intersectionality is bantered about quite a bit, but that fundamental belief that all forms of oppression are in some way connected. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a very important component for people to understand. And when we talk to other individuals about animals, it's very important that we begin by listening and listening to what their trigger points might be. Are those individuals really interested in health? Are they really interested in human rights? Are they really interested in environmental issues? And being able to respond to people in a way that is going to resonate for them. So something I literally just saw on Facebook this morning, in fact, was an article, and I'm sure that, you know, anyone who's on Facebook or can find it, or we can send it to you, but it was an article written by a former slaughterhouse worker in the UK. And this article was on the BBC, and he was describing his own experiences of working in a slaughterhouse, and unfortunately, sadly, also describing colleagues that committed suicide as a direct result of their work in these slaughterhouses. So there is an example of, you know, an individual who, you know, as rather a talking point with an individual who, although they may not be all that interested in animals, they would certainly be interested in the plight of these human beings who work in a slaughterhouse. So there's lots of ways that we can advocate for animals and be thinking about how it impacts people too. And really, there are so many ways that can be done. It is limitless, whether we're talking about global starvation, whether we're talking about food deserts and food shortages. But any one of these things are really critical to put in our back pockets, as it were, and prepare ourselves for when we might be faced with a question or a conversation.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about when we just before it started, we were talking about this concept of slow violence. What I just came across from Rob Nixon, who's at Princeton, and he talks about it from a perspective of looking at environmental justice and you know, or non-justice with indigenous peoples. And I was thinking about this notion of the cupcake, you know, in a sense that, you know, someone might say, oh, well, you know, they're just bringing cupcakes to the workroom. But in a sense, I looked at it as, you know, it's kind of an antidote to slow violence. It's a gesture of connection. It's a gesture of care. You know, someone might pick it up and go, oh, wow, that's really cool. You know, not even think about it and then find out it's vegan, right? So right. Thinking of these positive, again, this yes. tagline for this, for our Living One webinar is, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? Yeah. And I also, maybe you can talk about that, because I really feel that in sharing with, you know, how you and I have discussed things, and also looking at your work where you've really been aware, and you are personally, as you shared, very affected emotionally by the suffering and the unfairness and things like that. But nonetheless, I feel that you are embedding the problem into the solution, so that in a sense that when we hear a problem, we're in the context of solution. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a question too. I don't know if I should answer that first, maybe quickly, Gay, and then yeah. So there was a question on the chat box. I certainly want to acknowledge that about the conceptual difference for me between animals and humans. I think that's a great question. And I think that, for me personally, to answer that question for the individual asking, is I actually prefer using the language human and more than human. That is the language I generally use, particularly in my writing. And sometimes I speak sometimes a little differently than I write, like most people. But when I'm writing and I'm being careful about how I describe those differences, the way I describe them is that human beings are what we all know them to be. And more than human is every other living thing that is not human. So again, I tend to use for the individual asking, human and more than human. And more than human is a term we're seeing more in academia now. I actually have done a tremendous amount of research on which terms resonate for me. Dr. Lisa Kemmerer uses animal, A-N-Y-M-A-L, Dr. Lisa Kemmerer, K-E-M-M-E-R-E-R. And there's different academics that use different phraseology, but that is the phraseology I tend to prefer, and one that I'm most comfortable with. And I think one that best describes, at least from my viewpoint, the fact that we have an obligation to all living beings, and that includes the water and the trees and the land. So for me, it becomes an all-encompassing term, and our obligation to all life becomes subsumed within that phraseology. So I hope that answers this gentleman's a question, Gay. And I confess I've sort of sidetracked myself now a little bit.
I'll refresh my.
Can you mind, Gay? Thank you.
No. What I was saying is that, like our tagline is, we know what's wrong, but what is right look like. And the reason we did this was because that in a sense, the vision, and this gets back to that notion of the heterogeneity. So, I'm an animal rights person. Well, I'm very different than you and very da-da-da-da-da.
Right.
So in other words, creating a kind of a vision which goes across these community barriers or community differences, and talk about, what are we working toward?
Right.
And there's a lot of very difficult kinds of questions. We've talked about the notion of our role right now predominantly as a social engineer. I get my dog spayed and neutered, and I do this and this, and I do it for them. But nonetheless, we're social engineers. I conserve elephants, social engineering. So in terms of rights and self-determination and social justice movements, it's not having these kind of control type of colonial paradigms, but rather being in a role of facilitation and liberation. So what I was noting, though, is, and so the idea of it having a vision of the future, to start envisioning what does it mean to live this way. And I was reflecting on your work, and that I feel that although you are very aware of the quote-unquote problems and issues, nonetheless, I do feel that you are couching a lot of your work in solution space. So we may be looking at a problem, but you approach it from the perspective of the solution, and that's a very different kind of a feeling and a very different kind of a paradigm. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Gay, I would love to. Thank you. I think that, first of all, you've summarized it very, very well. And what is forefront in my mind with virtually every single thing I do is solutioning. I think that might come from many years in the for-profit sector. My training in that area is always, okay, I don't care what the problem is, tell me what you want me to do about it. So I think that we can learn a lot from that space as activists, because we can get mired in the problem without focusing on the solution. So one very practical thing everybody listening can do is start thinking about solutioning. And that solutioning can be things that are, again, I'm going to use the going from big to small, but I'm going to start small and go big. In sort of the myopic day-to-day life, we can think about things like bringing cupcakes. We can think about things like, your kids are having a pizza party. Well, why don't you order a vegan pizza or talk to the school? So there's solutioning that way, instead of sitting home and being perhaps not so happy about, dairy pizza being delivered to your kid's school. Then as we sort of move out in a bit of a bigger way, and we start thinking about what does really the future look like from almost a commercial perspective. And unfortunately, I don't think capitalism is going away anytime too soon. And one of the things we hear about a lot in the animal rights movement, and people ask me this question all the time, and it's always quite funny because they always think they're going to catch me when they ask me. And they say, yeah, but what are people going to do for a living? And, there's not going to be any jobs if we don't have any animals. And, so there's all sorts of really, people trying to, find these ways to justify the ongoing, use and abuse of animals. But if we take that bigger vision of the future, and I wrote down that that's what you said, vision of the future, there are so many ways that we can contemplate a future even a few years from now in all areas of animal exploitation. So if we look at animal exploitation and we talk about animals for food, animals for biomedical testing, animals for entertainment, I mean, every one of those ways in which animals are being used, there are solutions within them that are being that are being manifested today. So if we talk about medical testing as an example, I can tell you here in Canada, at the University of Windsor, they've just opened the very first Canadian Centre for Alternatives to Animal Methods. It is 100% non-animal testing medical laboratory at the University of Windsor. And it's run by an incredible woman who I'm honored to know. Her name is Charu, and she is just amazing. So think about all the jobs that can be created in that environment. Then I think about things like entertainment. And with, AI today, think about the plethora of jobs that can get created through AI, where we don't need animal trainers anymore, but we might need people who have better skills in creating animals in an AI manner. And then, of course, we think about food, and we think about today, there are more options for things like pea protein that never existed before. I can tell you that a decade ago, there were only, I believe, 11 pea protein based products in all of the United States on grocery shelves. Today, there's 327 new pea protein based products that have been launched in 2019 alone. So once again, this idea of what does the future look like without the use of animals? The future looks bright. The solutions are available, and they are real, and they are exciting. If we look at things like, I have, for those friends of mine that know me well, I have a small problem with purses. I have a little bit of an issue with purses. Now, I justify it by saying that it's a great advocacy tool because I always have a cool purse, and it creates a conversation, right? And then I make sure I tell people that it's not leather, but there's some great pineapple. I just bought the most gorgeous pineapple leather purse. I just bought another new purse not that long ago, made of recycled bamboo, and it looks like paper. I mean, so there are so many new and exciting ways to look at our future that doesn't include animals. Mm-hmm. And if we think even about the world 10 years ago, and we look at the industries that don't exist 10 years ago, whether those that were viable 10 years ago and are starting to trickle out, it's not just animal industries. It's things like printing presses and newspapers and big cameras and I mean, we must evolve. We must be constantly looking for solutions to all sorts of life's challenges. And this is the time, this is the most exciting time to be looking for other ways to do the same kinds of things, but without exploiting animals and still creating new and exciting jobs and opportunities.
No, I'm going to pop your balloon, but I have to say is now that you've shared your kryptonite, everyone knows how to get to you.
Yes, if you want to bribe me, send me a full purse.
So I'm going to pop the balloon, and I know, I mean, this is really, what you said is really inspiring, but at the same time, I know you feel, or it's certainly been your experience, that you think that the animal rights movement, again, as we say, it's heterogeneous, but
Yes.
we'll use that as a kind of a symbol, is having difficult time in terms of the evolution of a successful model. This is part of your dissertation research as well. Do you want to say a little bit more in terms of maybe even introduce some of the ideas in terms of using a particular model that's been used in other assessments of other human-oriented movements?
Yes, it is definitely something that I believe is the single biggest challenge in our movement. And that, in my view, comes from a place where many of the organizations that are in the animal rights movement have what I might say not dedicated the appropriate amount of energy to the care of their people. And they've been perhaps almost myopically focused on external advocacy for animals. And they have failed to structure their organizations in such a way that the most basic forms of organizational development are being completely overlooked. My background in the for-profit sector, as Liz had mentioned, is in organizational development. I was the vice president of one of the largest software companies in the world for many, many years. They were called SAP. And I was also a partner of an employment and labor law firm in Toronto for 10 years. And I'm very focused on the importance of organizational infrastructure in order for any group to be truly effective. Because if we don't take care of people who do the work doesn't get done. And one of the things we've seen in the animal rights movement is a troubling time through AR Me Too. So the Me Too movement definitely hit the animal rights sector as well. And much of that was due to the fact that there wasn't clear routes of resolution, particularly for women in the movement, that they did not have anyone to go to when they were challenged with something that might have been occurring that was inappropriate. There were issues where boards of directors were not meeting their governance principles as it related to both ethically, legally, and financially. And those are things that I'm very focused on in my doctoral work right now, is looking at ways that we can, as a movement, enhance how each of these groups are organized and create a commitment in a way that doesn't currently exist to better organizational development principles, but where those principles are going to be, of course, different than the for-profit sector, is that we want to, and in fact, in my view, must contemplate all aspects of the health of the individuals within these organizations. We must contemplate their emotional health. We must contemplate the health of the land. We must contemplate the health of the air and the water. And we must contemplate the health of the other sectors of social justice movements. So there has been, yeah. Go ahead, Gay.
Well, I was going to say, I just wanted to, just in sort of an educational thing. For me, I learned, that's because I got to spend hours talking to you. But if you could just say, is there an intrinsic difference between the for-profit and the social, what you're calling social profit or synonymous nonprofit? Is there something intrinsically different? And I'm going to ask you a question so you can keep talking. And then the second one thing is, are the things that you're talking about peculiar or particularly pronounced in the social profit sector? And I've got a third one.
Okay.
And that third one is, which I think is very important, is in the dynamic of the animal rights movement, which includes rescue, activism, sanctuary, etc. You brought up the Me Too movement. There is there's an intrinsic tension, if you want to call it, or sort of a polarity in terms of leadership has been dominated by one gender. Well, guess what that is? And then the worker bees, a lot of the movement organizations have been generated by females.
Yes.
Those are the three parts, and I just wanted to ask them at the same time so you could really dive into those things.
And I scribbled a few notes, so I hope I got your questions down. If I didn't, then you stop me. You put up your hand and say, "Stop, Krista, I need to clarify." When we look at the for-profit sector, there is a lot that we can learn from that sector. And yes, I do use the phrase social profit. I don't particularly love the phrase nonprofit, because I don't like that word non, because we are in our sector creating huge profit. It's just not quantified in the same way that money is quantified. So I tend to use the phrase social profit as opposed to nonprofit. But in the social profit sector, there's a lot that we can learn from the for-profit sector, particularly in areas of organizational development and governance. There are differing obligations in the for-profit sector where there is a higher level, in my view, of having been in it for a long time, there's a higher level of oversight in the for-profit sector that doesn't always exist in the social profit sector. So oversight can come from clients, oversight can come from boards, for-profit boards, legislative bodies, and there is a higher preponderance of individuals within the for-profit sector who are willing to put their hand up, make legal claims if they need to do that, or make other forms of claims to other quasi-judicial bodies when things are not going the right way. And then, of course, there is unions and other forms of trade organizations that also bring in oversight around things like employment standards and health and safety. And so there's a lot that happens in the for-profit sector that provides for oversight that this social profit sector does not often have. In the social profit sector, I want to be clear that my only experience is in the animal rights movement. I've never worked in the social profit sector in any other area. But I have done a lot of academic and literature review in that area. And what my understanding is that there are similarities between the animal rights sector and other social profit groups. Having said that, there are really three main challenges that we face in the animal rights for social profit sector. One of them is we are the newest kid on the block, right? We've been around the shortest period of time. We are the smallest. If you look at almost any other social profit organization, whether it's the LGBTQ movement or women's movement or people of color or whatever it is, they're all bigger than we are. We're teeny, 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 tiny, right? And then the third challenge that we have in our movement is what you said, Gay, which is we know that well in excess of 70% of all the individuals within the movement, both employees and volunteers, because volunteers make up a very significant component of workers in sanctuaries and in any form of grassroots organization. The majority of them are women, and the majority of the leadership are white men. And those white men, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, going back to what we talked about earlier, have these utilitarian values. So these values where what they are indicating as critical components to activism is utilitarianism. So for the most numbers, which is not based on what we call care philosophy, which is really creating probably the single biggest divide in our movement right now, is this idea that this utilitarian philosophy that's really had a hold on the movement for quite some time by a number of these individuals has been quite troubling.
Can you say a little bit clarification for everyone,
yeah.
Just in simple terms, maybe criteria by criteria, what would be, utilitarianism, same is more hierarchical, care ethic is more horizontal. Can you go through a couple of characteristics to sort of orient us?
Yes. So utilitarianism takes the position that decision-making is based strictly on the number of animals that can be either saved or the number of animals where their pain and suffering can be reduced. So it is pretty exclusively, not 100%, but pretty exclusively about numbers of animals. So somebody that had a purely utilitarian perspective on advocacy would really only be advocating and spending their time, energy, and money on advocating for fishes, because we know that fishes are, and it is fishes, for those of you who are looking for the plural of fish, it is fishes. I'm not saying that incorrectly.
What about octopus? What is it?
That I believe it's an I. Is it not an I, that one?
Or octopuses.
It is pusses? Oh, look at us all learning together. They would be wanting to spend their time, energy, and money on fishes and chickens, particularly birds that are used for their bodies, for meat, because those two species are the most abused species by number in the world, right? So we know that there are about 70 billion land animals that are slaughtered for food every year. And we know that the vast majority of them are chickens. And we know that there are in the trillions of aquatic animals that are slaughtered every year for food. And a utilitarian wouldn't, for instance, want to spend money on saving elephants in a circus, or wouldn't want to spend money on saving one whale or one, let's say a killer whale at a marine land or such a park. I don't know the names of all these parks, I apologize. SeaWorld and such. So the decision making that they engage in is purely utilitarian, utility by number versus care-based. And one of the challenges in that way of thinking is it really fails to contemplate the fact that change can happen through one example, one situation. So I take the example of the lady who was the producer of Blackfish. The story goes that she took her daughter to a SeaWorld park. She was so mortified what was happening with Tilikum at the time. She produced that documentary, and that documentary has now led to SeaWorld stocks literally plummeting. It's led to multiple pieces of legislative change, including legislative change that happened here in Canada, where whales and other aquatic life can no longer be held captive. I mean, so it doesn't contemplate individual care of animals. A utilitarian would also believe that sanctuaries, quite frankly, are not a good expenditure of money, because too much money is being spent on a small number of animals, but they wouldn't be considering how that, I can tell you at Happily Ever Esther, we have almost 3 million social media followers, and we are helping to make changes every single day to people's decisions about their consumption habits. So it's that real challenge in our movement right now that's causing, some turmoil. And it's something that I would very much, and am trying to work on, at least creating being more open to other ways of contemplating activism.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We're nearing, unfortunately, we're nearing sort of the end. But I would like to sort of come around in terms of, it seems that you did, you've done this amazing arc of really giving a sort of a short course in terms of the animal rights movement and redefining exactly what that actually means. And I think one of the things that I've really learned from this is that, again, your theme of saying that human liberation, animal liberation, life liberation is all one. And in that sense, that really speaks to revisioning economic systems.
It does.
In a very fundamental way, And I would say having to do with that, which is another topic unto itself, maybe we can drag you back here for part 2.
Sure.
But the idea is that, and again, this also comes into the beginning of your presentation and discussion, was our own identity. So that we can't forget that the single person, the single chicken, the single whatever is very powerful. I was just remembering a quote from Mahatma Gandhi that said, I have 3 opponents, and, one of them, which I make pretty good, headway with, is the British Empire. And he said, the other one, well, that's not so good, but I still make some headway, or the Indian people. And he said, but the third one is, I don't make any headway at all. And that's myself. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the notion, where I think you're really bringing this lesson in about the power, the potency, and the need to really focus on our individual psychological, social awareness and how we interact, which is so very powerful.
It is. And, for any of the listeners that want to go and, Google the trolley dilemma, any of us in school have, been through that 100 times in 100 ways. But that really is the best articulation of the difference between utilitarianism and individual right over life. And, what would we do? Well, we need to act in a way where our actions are right. And one of the challenges also with utilitarianism is it takes the position that we should be able to, in essence, foresee the future. And we can't. And we don't know often what things are going to bring. I'll leave everyone with one quick story, and then we'll certainly open up to any questions, and I'll happily stay as long as anyone wants. But there's a beautiful story written by Ursula Le Guin, and I don't know if many of you know her, but she is an incredible, incredible storyteller. And she wrote a story called Those Who Walk Away from Omelas. If you don't have it, I'll email. It's a 4-page PDF. I can email it to Liz, and she can send it out. You can also Google it yourself. It's free online. Once again, it's called Those Who Walk Away from Omelas. And the very short version of the story is that Omelas is a town, and it is a town that is built on perfection. Everybody is perfect. The town is perfect. The weather is perfect. It is a perfect place to be. And the story opens with us joining the residents of Omelas on a beautiful summer picnic day. Well, we learn that as part of the payment for living in Omelas, there is a child. They don't tell us whether this child is male or female. We only learn that this child lives in the basement of a building that's in the center of town. And one of the requirements that all the townspeople have to go through at some point, particularly when they hit a certain age, they have to go and physically look at this child. This child is in a room. This child is constantly vocalizing. This child is in pain. This child has never been outside, doesn't see the light of day. No one touches this child. This child is hungry. And it is the obligation of everyone to understand that the price to pay in perfection is knowing that this child is suffering. So the question then becomes, do we walk away from Omelas? So are we able to look at this child and go back to our perfect life? Or do we look at this child and decide that this is not okay? And what are we going to do about it? So I think that is sort of probably the best articulation, Gay, of what is utilitarianism and what is a right to a life. And again, it's a 4-page short story. It is a beautiful story. You can even find it on YouTube, actually. I know there are videos of people actually reading it out. So if folks don't love reading, but they may want to sit back and listen, Those Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula Le Guin.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can tell we have a lot more to go over, so I agree. I think a part 2 is going to be in order here. So, and thank you to Gay also for your wonderful questions. Just before I end the recording and we switch to the question and answer portion, I want to thank everyone, first of all, for making the time to be here. And also invite you all to next month's Living One webinar. We're going to be interviewing Susan Graylock on February 2nd. So it's going to be a Groundhog's Day event. So yeah, we hope we see you all there.